what's your record for no fins in meters?
102 meters. I think it's 331 feet. 4 minutes 10 seconds. It's pretty much even, like just over 2 minutes down and 2 minutes up.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jason Chambers podcast. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we talk to great people with great stories, and we talk about some really cool shit. So if you like that, click subscribe, turn on the alerts, and give us a thumbs up. Today, good friend of mine, world champion freediver, William Trubridge. Hey, Will.
Hey, Jason. How's it going?
Good. So, let's just address the elephant in the room here. Second kid, and you're sleeping already. What are you doing?
You know, the tactic is to go to bed with the kids. So I'm in bed like at 8:30. And that means that if we wake up a few times at night and waste a couple of hours here and there, then I still get like 7, 8 hours sleep before.
So I'm always fascinated by how other couples work, the schedule. Now that you're on your second one, it's probably a little easier, but how do you and Sachika work that? Is it I take one night, you take one night, or how do you guys work the intricacies of going crazy?
No, so we're sleeping in adjacent rooms at the moment. I've got one baby in my room and she's got the other. And then like if she needs help with a nappy change or something that's gone wrong, then she just yells out and I come in typically like once or twice a night.
Okay. So you guys are in totally separate rooms with the kids. How come you didn't put the kids in one room? Wouldn't that be, or just the one waking up the other one?
Yeah, because the new one is breastfeeding like all through the night. It just makes sense for him to be in bed with mum so that she can just roll over.
Sounds like it makes sense for you to be in bed with moms too. That's good. Well, any more kids on the way?
No, it's early days. This one's just a month old, so okay. We'll see. I'm keen to draw a line into 2, but
yeah, you got the boy and a girl. That's like the home run of children. If you can't get
exactly.
That's great.
But Sachika feels like she might not be done yet, so we'll see what happens.
Well, between Auckland, New Zealand, the Bahamas, and Japan, they're gonna have a crazy upbringing. I mean, talk about culture clashes and really getting exposed to the world, like you did too. I mean, you grew up on a boat. What was that like? Give me that whole backstory.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was normal because my earliest memories were living on the boat. We moved onto it when I was a year and a half, but we lived on it until I was kind of like 10 or 11 years old. So that whole segment was all just kind of sailing around, playing in the water all the time. It was great.
Did you have any, what was your schooling like? Were you just homeschooled?
Yeah, homeschooled at first, and then I went to a kindergarten in the BVI's. I went to a primary school in Tahiti and learned like French with all the other Tahitian kids. Then we did correspondence school in New Zealand for a while. And my mother is a teacher as well, so she was kind of through it all, homeschooling us and teaching us. But I think at that age, like the best education you can have is just getting out there and getting amongst it with nature and like playing on the beach and in the water and looking for shells and fish and stuff. That just as good.
Did you have any, when your parents would go like port to port, would they stay somewhere for several months, or would you guys be, I mean, it was a sailboat. This wasn't like by any measurable metric like a yacht you were on, right? It was like a smaller, mid-sized sailboat, right?
Yeah, in English we call it a yacht when it's a sailboat. It's kind of the opposite of the American.
Tricky English.
It's definitely just like a little tubby sailboat, 45-foot long, single mast. But it was big enough for a family. And we would stay on an island sometimes for a while, like we're in Tahiti, I think for almost a year. My dad would find work and we'd go to a school and then we'd carry on, went to Fiji, Tonga. We pretty much did it like connect the dots across the Pacific.
And did you guys make multiple trips kind of in that loop?
No, we were always kind of heading west we left from Gibraltar in Spain and across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, through the Panama, and then across the Pacific, but always going west until we got to New Zealand. That's where we stopped.
Why New Zealand? Your dad just get tired of like rowing? He's like, New Zealand.
We were actually planning on going back to Tahiti. So New Zealand was supposed to be like a stop to work and get permits to stay in Tahiti longer. But then after a while, New Zealand just became kind of a home, and it was good for us to start going to regular schools and stuff as well.
So what was the longest you were actually at sea for with your family? Without seeing land?
What's that?
Yeah, like without actually like, stopping even for like whatever, yeah.
Without seeing land, I think the longest was 3 weeks.
3 weeks?
From from Galapagos Islands to French Polynesia.
That's crazy. See, at that age, you can't really, that's all you knew. Like, if you told me I was going to be on a boat in the middle of the ocean with, limited, I would imagine, GPS and satellite signaling back then, right? We're about the same age.
Yeah.
So, it was your dad just navigating using like stars and how did
Exactly.
that? Yeah, that's crazy.
A sextant, which has got like a series of mirrors, so that you can bring a position of a star down to the horizon or the moon or the sun, and use that with the charts. It's pretty complex trigonometry to calculate your position, and even then it's not that accurate.
That seems really, really dangerous. Like, I can't imagine, granted, I have no fucking clue what I'm doing, right, with that, but like, I can't imagine being dropped on a boat and have to be responsible for like if I'm offshore like a little bit, and I'm like, oh, I'm getting too far away, like, to be not seeing land at some point. I wonder if there's any like panic that gets induced. You're a kid, so you probably, that's all you knew. You weren't like ever getting scared about that. But was there ever any stories your parents told you about getting lost at sea?
Yeah, well, my mum wrote a book about it called Passages, and she talks about some of the kind of the worries that she had. She was more worried about it than my dad, because like if dad went overboard, he was the only one who knew how to navigate. So there would have just been the rest of the crew would have just been kind of wandering aimlessly, hoping to hit land.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's different to how you would go sailing now, where there's a lot of redundancy.
Yeah, not just overboard too, because if you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean, like, you're basically back in the Renaissance eras in terms of medical, what you're able to, it's like you're like, you're not gonna get Black Plague, but like a really bad chest congestion could turn really bad where he can't do anything, because you don't have medicine right there, hospitals. That's crazy. So you were on the boat for like, you said 10 years you were on there till you were 10?
Yeah, more or less.
Did you have any inkling of what an odd upbringing that was compared to like kids that you'd meet or see, or what did you just feel like, yeah, this is just my thing?
Only when those kids told us how old we were, really. Like, for us it was normal, and the other kids we'd meet on similar boats were the same as us. But then when we went to school, we were kind of maybe a little bit backwards in terms of kind of social development, and we had funny accents and stuff. So yeah, then we struggled to fit in at first.
Okay, so you guys landed in New Zealand. Is it safe to say that growing up on a boat started your affinity for water and the ocean and diving?
Yeah, it's safe to say. I will never know, because that's the way it turned out. But for me, it just feels like it was inevitable that I would get into freediving and spend a life in the seas one day.
Were you freediving before you ever really even knew you were freediving? Just as a kid, going deeper and trying to get deeper and grab food and shells off the bottom of the ocean?
Pretty much, yeah. Like myself and my brother, who was 2.5 years older, we had kind of a rivalry to see who could go the deepest snorkeling. We didn't know anything about freediving. It was just kind of these big, like, fishbowl masks, stubby little plastic fins, and that was it. We'd just kind of tear down to the bottom as fast as we could, grab a handful of sand or a rock or something, and then just scream back up to the surface. So there's no kind of relaxation or technique, and it was just trying to go as deep as we could. And like that, we got to, I think, 50 feet when I was 8 and my brother was 10.
Wow.
But again, with no inkling about the sport of freediving. And I didn't actually find out about the sport itself until I was in my early 20s.
So when you guys were out there and you'd be diving, obviously you can grab lobsters and stuff like that, but was the primary food source fishing?
Definitely primary protein source. We would trail a line behind the boat and often catch like mahi, tuna, marlin once. And so between that and then spearfishing, when we had anchor at islands, catching lobster and groupers and stuff, we'd get all the fish we needed. We'd sometimes also trade that fish with locals for vegetables and fruit as well.
So was there ever a time you were on the boat and you guys had like got skunked fishing for a few days and you're like, oh, I'm getting kind of hungry here. What's going on? Let's start opening up the spectrum of what we eat here. Algae's looking good,
Yeah, well, we had in the bilges, we had like a huge stock of tins. I think my parents spent like a few $1,000s on groceries, which back in the day was a lot of tins, and filled up the bilge with all these like tin baked beans and stuff. So yeah, we had plenty of food, but we'd try and kind of live off the sea as much as possible.
Baked beans and mahi mahi. That cabin must have smelled amazing. That's so you finally landed in New Zealand, and you said from you were 10, 11 years old until you really got exposed to freediving in your 30s. What happened in that gap? How did you decide, I want to find, how did you find freediving, or did freediving find you, or was there a path that led you down there to freediving?
Yeah, I think it might be more accurate to say that I kind of remembered freediving because it was always there. And looking back, I can see the signs that it was kind of trying to come out. There's one interesting little story about when I was at university, and I was kind of majoring in biology, minoring in partying, drugs, and all the rest of it. And one night, for some reason, I don't know, it was probably the only night of my university years, I was stone cold sober, found myself on a dance floor. I think I got roped into going out that night by my mates, but I hadn't had anything at all. And I was watching the kind of the montage of the video montage that they put up on the dance floor to go with the music, and kind of really getting into that and the music at the same time. And these words popped into my mind pretty much spontaneously. And it's just 4 lines, dare I say, kind of like a poem, I guess. But to this day, they're the most accurate kind of description that I've come up with about the allure of freediving. And this was before I'd even heard about freediving as a sport. Like if someone had said, "Do you know about freediving?" I would have kind of pictured people jumping off cliffs, or I wouldn't even had a clue. So that shows that it was always there. It was ready to come out. And there's like a string of episodes like that. Like whenever I was swimming at high school, I preferred to swim breaststroke, which is the stroke that I use now for going deep, no fins. But I wasn't that quick. Like I wasn't elite because I'd spend too much time underwater on the stroke. Like I'd do the long, nice pull kind of underwater, enjoying that part of the stroke. But it's not the most efficient way to swim breaststroke. So there's these little kind of glimpses that it was there, ready to come out. And then when I was, I think, 21, and I heard from a mate about the sport of freediving, I was like, my ears pricked up, and I had to give it a go.
So what was your first official give it a go like? You went with your friend and you saw this and you're like, I've done this before. What was that like?
No, actually, I was living in London at the time, and I heard about freediving, so I decided to go to Central America. I passed through Miami, went to a dive shop, got like a pair of long fins, wetsuit, mask, and what have you, and just went to Belize by myself, and went out with the scuba boats, diving just off the back of the boat while they were doing the scuba tours. And it's a very risky way to freedive, because the cardinal rule of freediving is never dive alone. But that's what I was doing. I didn't have any kind of formal education or anything, so I didn't know the risks that I was running. And back then, I wasn't going deep. I was only going to kind of like 15, 20 meters, 60 feet, but really, really enjoying it. And spent kind of 2 or 3 months in the Caribbean, went from Belize to Honduras to the Bay Islands, and camped out there for another couple of months. And yeah, that was it for me. After that, I was sold, and then I traveled back to Europe and kind of moved to the Mediterranean, to Sardinia, and spent the next few years there training and studying under one of the top freedivers of the 90s, Umberto Pellizzati. Was kind of like my mentor back in the day.
So your first like attempt, you think you went to about 60 feet, and that seems like an exceedingly impressive performance for somebody who can barely get to the bottom of a 10-foot pool if like he drops his sunglasses, right? So like, were you practicing certain breathing exercises, or were you just an avid swimmer? Because 60 feet by every measurable metric that I can view, or 18 meters, that's impressive in and of itself to me.
Right, yeah, I'd been doing some breath hold exercises back in London before we left, and a little bit of kind of swimming underwater in the pool. But at first in freediving, it's mostly about equalization. If you're able to equalize your ears and you can move fairly efficiently in the water, pretty much anyone can hold their breath for at least a minute or two, and that's enough to go to at least kind of 15, 20 meters, 60 feet.
Is that just using your arms like economy of motion, so you're not sucking out of all the oxygen into your muscles, or what's the primary focus behind that?
Yeah, I was using fins, so swimming down like the classic flippers, bifins, and just being economical. So not hyperextending your neck, not kind of going into a curved position. So being streamlined and relaxing, so that you're not like in that panic mode when you're underwater.
So like, what does freedive training look like? Is it just the repetition of the same things, or is it kind of like if you're beginning, you need to work on A, B, C, D, and that like a progression almost like a martial art belts would be?
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of both. It's almost like whack-a-mole in the sense that there's so many different things you have to train contemporaneously. You have to be in good kind of cardiovascular shape, but without some of the it gets complex because there's a lot about VO2 max that we don't want. We don't want excess capillarization of the periphery, so too many blood vessels in your periphery. We don't want too many mitochondria in the cells. So there's a specific type of fitness that needs to be trained. Resistance to low oxygen and to high carbon dioxide both need to be trained. Then there's the flexibility, because you have to be able to sustain like a very high pressure underwater at depth. So we have to develop thoracic flexibility, equalization maneuvers. And then there's the technique itself of swimming. So working on kind of streamlining efficient technique, explosive power in the stroke. And then there's the mental side as well. So being able to completely relax and shut down the mind so that the brain itself isn't consuming oxygen, and so that you don't kind of get into an elevated state of mind or adrenaline during the dive itself.
Do you videotape yourself in your dives so that you can look at how you can use your body more efficiently, or?
Yeah, we do. So we have, in competitions, actually, we have a remote, like a drone, which follows us down and films us all the way to the bottom and back. And that's really useful for seeing the kind of the little errors that you might be making in terms of position or technique during the dive.
So you talked about pressure. What's the most amount of pressure that you've encountered on a personal level? I'd imagine that has to go in sync with how far down you are, right? Or does it taper out at some point?
Yeah, it's directly related to the depth. So each 30 feet that you go down, you get another atmosphere of pressure, which means that like the weight of all the air above us, as we're sitting here, is kind of, what is it, like 6 or 7 miles of air above us. That weight is the same as 30 feet of water.
Would that be would that be akin to like G forces, like body pressure, or is it's different in terms? I'm trying to figure out what that would feel like. Is it just like the added outside pressure inwards, like you feel that constriction everywhere?
Yeah, it's pressure from the outside inwards,
Mm-hmm.
but you only feel it where there's an airspace. So like your arm, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
is incompressible. It's made of fluid and solid. So you don't feel any pressure there. But in your chest, because it contains air, that airspace will compress with the pressure outside. So you feel your lungs reducing in volume quite quickly. Already by 10 meters, by 30 feet, your lungs have halved in volume. And by 30 meters, 100 feet, they've halved again. So at 30 meters or 100 feet, you actually have a volume in your lungs that's less than what you do after a full exhale on the surface. If I push all the air out of my lungs, that's about the kind of the volume of air that remains in my lungs at 100 feet. So past that depth, as we go to 200, 300, or 400 feet, the lungs are reduced in volume a lot more, and you have to be able to accommodate that pressure change by being flexible in the thorax, the rib cage, your rigid airways, the trachea and the bronchi, and also the diaphragm, this plate of muscle that we have underneath the rib cage that has to be flexible so that it can kind of come upwards like a plunger to take over the space that's being lost inside the rib cage.
What's the biggest concern before somebody like tries for a world record attempt or goes to a depth where they're pushing their boundaries?
There's a bunch of concerns. Probably the most common risk is what we call shallow water blackout, which is basically just means you've run out of oxygen at the end of the dive. Because if you run out of oxygen like halfway down at the bottom, then you've really miscalculated it, and that's not normally going to happen. But if you kind of go 10% or 5% over your potential, then you're going to run out just below the surface. And that's why we have safety divers who are there in the last kind of 20, 30 meters to grab you and bring you to the surface if you do black out. So that's the classical risk. But there are other risks, such as a injury sustained due to the pressure. So if you're not flexible enough, or you do some kind of a sudden exaggerated movement at depth, then you can create an injury inside the lung tissue itself that starts bleeding. So when you come to the surface, you'll then be coughing blood, and that can also compromise the gas exchange in the lungs. If there is blood that's flowing into the alveoli in the lungs, then it can stop the oxygen being absorbed. So then that becomes a big risk because you cannot reoxygenate after the dive.
Wow. So if someone blacks out, like blacks out close to the surface, I think that like we see movies and maybe there's a timeline attached to it, but you see in a movie when someone runs out of air, they do this herky jerky spasm. I'm now drinking water, and then they're dead in 5 seconds. But that's not the case. I've seen guys black out in videos and they just kind of go limp, right? Like you get knocked out or you fell out. Is there some sort of a reflex that closes that off? And what's the timeline attached to that I got to get this guy out of the water in X number of seconds?
So typically, almost all blackouts underwater are what we call dry blackouts, which means that the mouth closes and the body doesn't, and also the larynx, the epiglottis closes, so it doesn't allow any air to come into the lungs. So even though you're unconscious under the water, the lungs are still completely dry. And in that state, if you're brought to the surface and your head is held above the surface and someone blows across your face ideally, then there are receptors in your face, trigeminal nerves, which detect the fact that you're above the surface again, the flow of air, and kind of wake you to the point where you can start breathing it spontaneously again, and then you'll oxygenate and you'll come to. So that's the process that happens in pretty much all blackouts, where the person is kind of retrieved within the first minute or two. If they're under the water for longer, then we can get a wet blackout where they may leak water into the lungs, or take a breath of water, and in that case, it's very difficult to resuscitate.
When someone's like coming up when they're scuba diving or when they're ascending, there's a certain rate you want to ascend at, right? Because if you go too fast, you can have some physiological reactions, right?
Yeah, that applies only to scuba diving.
Okay, I was going to ask if someone blacked out underwater, do you have to be aware of how fast you're bringing them up, or is it get them up as quickly as physically possible?
No, you don't have to worry about that. So typically the safety divers will bring them to the surface as fast as they can.
So going back to the pressure, we talked a little bit about that and then switch topics. What's the deepest you've gone with fins or monofin or?
The deepest I've gone now is 126 meters, and I've done that both with a monofin and also with free immersion, where you're pulling yourself down on the rope.
Okay, so there's how many disciplines total are there in freediving?
There's 3 major disciplines, with and without fins, and then there's free immersion where you're pulling on the rope.
Okay, so you had 126 meters, which is about what, 375-ish feet?
Actually, just over 400, I think it's 410.
Okay. So like a football field plus 2 extra end zones in the first row of like going underwater. So that's just one way, right? All the way down. You don't measure down 50 yards and up 50 yards, right? You measure the base. So you're traversing that football field all the way there and all the way back underwater on one breath. First of all, that's fucking insane. But like, what did the pressure feel like down there? And can you notice a difference is there a certain point where you're past, say, 50, 60, 70 meters and you no longer notice the pressure mounting? It's just, this is max pressure for me here on down?
No, you still do notice it, but ideally you'd still be comfortable with it, even at that depth. It's actually more, after a certain point, the pressure change is the same, but the volume change, because it's a ratio, it's Boyle's law, so it's proportional to the pressure. The volume change isn't that great. So we have what we call a pressure gradient, where the volume changes the most in the first few meters. But by the time I'm going past that 100-meter mark, the volume change isn't huge because there's not really that much volume left in any case. And that can be compensated actually by an influx of blood into the capillaries of the lungs. So the lungs have like a web of capillaries all through them, and those can actually swell up with blood that takes over some of the compressing airspace. And that's what we call the blood shift in freediving. It's actually mammals like whales and seals have the same thing, and it allows them to dive to like a mile underwater. So yeah, after a certain point, that's able to kind of pick up that loss, and it's more about just whether you're able to equalize your ears. That becomes a difficulty. And to do so, we fill our mouths with air. So at a certain depth, for me, it's around 30 or 40 meters. I kind of puff out my cheeks like a chipmunk with as much air as possible. And then I shut off the epiglottis so that that air is isolated from the lungs. It can't go back down. And I only use this air in my mouth in order to equalize the middle ears, where you have to kind of push air into them, otherwise your eardrums blow.
So you have like a whole like pilot's checklist then when you're going down. Like at here I do this, and then I got to do this, and then this. It's not just hold my breath and cross my fingers every time. You're thinking about your strokes, your technique, your warm up, your at what point I have to do certain things. If you misjudge where you need to do that, is that one of the effects of like how you perform in terms of whether or not you black out or you can make it all the way back?
It can be, yeah. It's more to like if you misjudge something on the way down, then it normally just means that you will have to turn early. You won't be able to make the target depth. If you misjudge something on the way up, like you lose the line, for instance, and so you're coming up without the line, which can be a little disconcerting, especially if it's dark, then that can lead to like what we call a loss of motor control, LMC, which is kind of a near blackout state or a full blackout itself.
Do you ever have if you're flying and you're a pilot, you're supposed to always rely on your gauges because your senses can get fooled as to which way is up. Is that ever a concern for freedivers where does the light cut out, first of all? What point is it black?
Depends where you're diving a little bit. Some lakes, it can be completely black from like 50 feet. And then in the open ocean, if it's perfect visibility, you could probably go 300, like 1,000 feet down and still have light.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, in the blue hole where we dive, typically on a good day, there's still light at 300-400 feet, but some days it's black down there. So we sometimes have to wear like little headlights so that we can see the rope in front of us.
So is it a concern ever getting discombobulated in terms of which way is up?
Not so much that, at least not for myself. I think your body has like a kind of an internal compass, and it's basically due to the fact that the upper body where the lungs are is slightly more buoyant than the lower body. So I think your body naturally orients itself in that position underwater in any case, but you would feel if you're moving opposing to that.
So when you black out underwater, two-part question. One, are you aware of the fact that, oh shit, I'm going to black out? And two, is there any panic in that moment?
So yes, at first I didn't used to be able to tell when you were going to black out because it's kind of subtle signals. Like all the while you have this urge to breathe that's building and building, but the blackout itself is kind of separate to that because the urge to breathe is raising CO2, whereas a blackout is due to the oxygen becoming too low. And there's not really so much symptoms with low oxygen. But yeah, over time, even those subtle symptoms, you do learn how to pick up on those. But typically, like on the way up in a dive, if I feel like it's going to be close or I'm not going to make it, especially in a no fins dive, then I can abort the dive by just pulling on the rope. So I have the rope in front of me. If I feel not so good, then I just grab the rope and start pulling up. And that makes it a lot easier, which typically means that I'll come to the surface fine. That if it's kind of a close call and I'm pushing all the way to the surface, then there's no like stark forewarning of the fact that you're gonna black out like a few seconds before. It's just a kind of a gradual shutting down of your mental senses.
And then the next thing you know, you're just being woken up like on the surface, or
someone's kissing you.
Yeah, just trying to wake up. That's right. Oh my goodness. So what is the pressure like that? I mean, we talked about this a couple of times, but like to give someone like a real world sense of what that pressure feels like. I know that I've seen stuff in the past, like a watermelon explodes at this level. Do you have any of those weird facts that will save me from having to use Google later?
I don't stick in my mind. There's a few like that, like if you open a champagne bottle at even just, I think, 40 or 50 meters, it won't fizz. The water inside will just be like flat.
Gotcha.
I think a tire, the pressure inside a tire is the equivalent of like 30 or 40 meters. A bicycle tire might be a bit more. But yeah, there's not a lot that, I think a truck tire might be kind of around 100 meters or so, but there's not a lot that has pressure beyond that.
So going back to your competitions, you were starting to freedive, you fell in love with it, you went off the back of the boats. At what point did you decide that you can be a competitive freediver and then move all the way to Long Island, Bahamas?
Yeah, I was living in Italy at the time and just really kind of mesmerized by this practice and the sport and devoting all my time to it. And I hadn't then reached a level where I was kind of close to a world record, but I had kind of decided that I wanted to pursue it and to kind of devote myself to trying to find out what my potential was in the sport. In particular, what my kind of aquatic potential is, because I see freediving as pretty much the purest expression of human aquatic potential. In all the other aquatic sports, we're not actually fully aquatic, we're just moving on the boundary between air and water. Like in swimming, half your body is in the water, half's out. All the other sports like I don't know, water polo or diving, you're kind of, the good stuff is happening above the surface, right? So freediving is the only sport where everything from the start of the performance to the finish is happening fully immersed in liquid. So it's kind of, for me, the definition of human aquatic potential. And so I was really intrigued and wanted to find out where I could go to and if I could extend kind of understanding of that human aquatic potential.
Well, and speaking of like understanding the limits of human potential, I think you've had multiple records over the years, and ironically, you've had to break your own records multiple times because no one's beaten you in some of those disciplines. And like I would say, the Cadillac of freediving is just no fins, right? So just hop in like Mother Nature put you, and go as far as you can down, come back up, and you hold the world record of that. So you've gone further underwater just using hands and feet than anybody else ever on written record. Is that accurate?
Yeah, pretty much.
There's probably a more articulate way to put that than that like paragraph or tagline. So that's what in your records, what's your record for no fins in meters?
102 meters. I think it's 331 feet.
Okay, so that's like a football field, just like taking a breath and going. What was the total time that took?
That dive, I think, was 4 minutes 10 seconds. So it's pretty much even, like just over 2 minutes down and 2 minutes up.
So 4 minutes and 10 seconds that you not only have to hold your breath, but you have to be able to manage your breath the entire route, both ways.
Yeah, it's an active breath hold. So it's not just the same as kind of taking a breath and sitting in your chair. You're moving and exerting yourself quite hard, like especially on their way up. The arm strokes, the leg kicks have to be quite strong because you're negatively buoyant at that stage. So when you turn around at 102 meters, if you don't do anything at all, you're going to sink pretty quickly. So you have to work against that negative buoyancy to come back to the surface.
So at some point, as you're swimming down, gravity takes over and you don't have to swim anymore. You can kind of just free fall down.
Exactly. From like about 30 meters or so, I enter the free fall, and there you just kind of like tuck in like a gannet diving into the water. You tuck your arms into your side and get a streamline. and that allows you to free fall as quickly as possible.
So does that marker depend on like what type of water you're in? If you're in really salty water in this part of the world versus less salty water here?
A little bit, yes. So the fresh water is less dense, which means you free fall quicker. You're heavier in the fresh water than the salt water, and the temperature and the salinity of the water affects a little bit as well.
So you went down 102 meters. What was training for that like, and how did you feel mentally? I know you had to do 2 different world record attempts to break your own record, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was training. I'm always kind of in training 11 months of the year, but specifically for that world record, I was training for about 18 months, pretty much all the time. And it's like I said before, it's a lot of things that you have to train all at the same time, and you'll find that one aspect is lagging, like your equalization isn't as good, so you have to work on that, or you have to work on your strength or your breath hold, your CO2 tolerance. So it's just kind of constantly monitoring all these aspects of training and making sure that you're all of them are in their kind of top form.
What's your biggest fear going into a competition?
The biggest fear is failure. They're just not doing the dives that I'd like to do, having a blackout. It's not so much the blackout itself, it's the fact that a blackout is a failure that I'm kind of concerned with. So yeah, that's always the.
I think like outside of the sport, there's this stigma that what you do is incredibly dangerous. It's very dangerous. How do you feel about that?
There is danger in the sport, and there are people who don't make it. But in competitions, it's very, very rare. So we've only had 1 fatality in competition so far. Most of the deaths that happen in freediving are people who go off and dive by themselves, especially spearfishers. If they push their limits too far by themselves and they have a blackout, then that's 100% fatal all the time.
So there used to be a sport, I forget the guy's name, he was down here in Miami, but I don't know if they still do it, where they would sit on like a sled that was just weighted and it was just hold on for the ride at Six Flags theme park. What was that?
So that was kind of back in the day, discipline called no limits freediving, and yeah, you just ride a sled down, you ride it back up, you have a balloon that inflates to bring you back up. It's more of a stunt than an actual athletic discipline, and the sport's kind of grown out of that. So now it's not recognized really for world record attempts anymore. There's only kind of 1 or 2 freedivers who really practice it anymore.
So in terms of the freediving community, when you started, do you see that it's about the same size, or is it growing more exponentially now because we can share things on social media? Or
yeah, it's been growing quite quickly, especially in like Asian countries. It's really taking off, and they say it's the fastest growing sector of the diving industry. So it's good to see, because it's kind of a natural way of being in the water, rather than kind of hulking around all this equipment with scuba, and all the carbon that's associated with that. It's a very kind of minimal, pure way of being underwater, and it also kind of allows people to experience being under the water on its own terms, like an aquatic creature. So you feel more integrated into that environment, and we've seen that freedivers typically are more kind of motivated to be stewards of the oceans and seas than scuba divers. They kind of feel more that they belong there and they want to take care of it.
so you never like worried about like the like, I mean, people, it's rare that people have died in the sport, but like, it just seems like it's such a risk because you're so far underwater. You can't just like open the car door at any point and go, I want to get out of the car, I don't like this ride anymore. You're making a commitment with every stroke down of a 1 stroke up. It's like that when you're flying a plane, there's a joke that like taking off is optional, landing is mandatory. I'd imagine breaking the surface both ways is, one way is optional, both ways is mandatory. That doesn't ever cross into your head, or is that not really even a factor in it anymore?
It definitely think about it. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it means that you don't have any other option, which is good, because you just got to get on with it, right? Like in the pool, there's pool disciplines where we try and swim as far as you can, backwards and forwards, laps of the pool underwater. And there it's kind of tough, because at any time you know that you could just pop your head up and be done with it. But if you put yourself 100 meters down underwater, then there's only one way to come out of it, is to swim those 100 meters back up to the surface.
So psychologically, it plays a big part of, you're going to have a real good performance today. So that's funny.
Yeah. So on the one hand, it's good for like that, but on the other hand, it means that there's more kind of stress going into it, because you know that you are going to do this dive. There's no, you can't kind of, you can turn early, but that would be obviously a failure itself. So yeah, it does make it more difficult on the whole, I think, mentally, this discipline, because there's no, as you say, you can't just say I sprained my ankle, so I'm gonna jump out of this race, kind of thing. There's no way out.
One of the things that you told me before that I always thought struck me as interesting was, in most sports, especially when you're competing at any high level, age works tremendously against you because of wear and tear in your joints, your bones, and things like that. And I was asking you about, like, longevity in the career, and you made some comment. I don't want to butcher it or put words in your mouth, but about like it helps you as you get older. How does that factor in as age as you get older as a freediver? Because we're still pushing the boundaries of where we can go. Because I mean, you've been the farthest human ever underwater. Is it 5 more meters? Is it 10 more meters? Is there a barometer in terms of how long you think you can do this, and also where do you think the human potential lies?
It's tough to say, because yes, we do see some slowing down of the metabolism, we think, and as we age, which could benefit freediving. But of course, there's other aspects of the physiology which are becoming less efficient. So it's like a balancing act, I guess. But I think mentally we become tougher as we age. We endure more, we kind of have more perspective about what sport actually is. And so we're kind of, a little bit tougher mentally. And perhaps that's why in other endurance sports, we often see athletes in their late 30s, early 40s who are still dominating. But in terms of like how much more potential there is in this discipline, how many more meters, it's not a question that I prefer to answer, because I just see it as like a gray area of, yes, we can definitely add another meter on. Could we add another 30 meters on? No. But the actual limit is somewhere in between, and it's just kind of like a scale of gray between the two.
Well, and that's almost got to be like, I forget what, there's an old statistic about, I don't know who it was that ran the first mile, like sub 5-minute mile or something. And before they did that, they thought Bannister, ran the first 4-minute mile. And I think before that, the general consensus was it's not possible to run a mile in 4 minutes. And then subsequent to him breaking it, we had like a waterfall of people kind of break that barrier. Do you think that in freediving, like once we get to a certain point, right now we think that's the limit, but if someone does that, we'll see more? Because you've held those records for a while, and no one's really come within like a few meters of really beating you. Do you think you're an outlier, or why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's interesting, because as you say, in most sports, there's kind of a clustering effect like that. In this particular discipline, it hasn't happened, at least in the last 10 years since I first went to 100 meters. No one else has repeated that. But I think I pretty much devoted myself to that discipline, and I moved to an island in the Bahamas where I could train that discipline as efficiently as I could. And no one else has kind of repeated that process, I guess. So maybe that's mandatory. In order to get to those depths, you really have to train in a blue hole for years on end in order to get to 100 meters.
I feel like it's the countdown till David Blaine tries to do an NBC stunt of him freediving 1 meter further than you or something. Like, this just seems like ripe for like a magic trick where you don't see the guy forever and then he comes back up. But that's crazy. So what's next on the docket for you? Are you focusing on breaking any records, taking some time off with the kids?
I've been taking a little bit of time off, paternity leave, if you will, but I'm still doing a little bit of training in this time, and I'm kind of getting the bug again to get back into the water. Here I can only really train in the pool at the moment. But no, next year I'll be training back at depth, and if I'm in a position to attempt world records doing that, there's also another like endurance project that I'm thinking of being involved in. So yeah, I've got a few pots on the stove.
Yeah, you know, like just going back to like how long there's people that compete in the freediving in the 60s, right? Even past that, I've seen some gents and ladies that look like they've been freediving since Jesus was around.
Yeah, people do. I mean, it's because it's such a soft sport. There's no like impact or anything, and we do see people in the 60s, 70s going pretty deep.
Do you think you'll still be competing when you're, you know, you're about the same age as me, about 40? I mean, do you think you'll be competing deep into your 50s and 60s, or do you think you'll take more of a coaching role and just mentoring?
Yeah, I'd be surprised if I'm competing kind of avidly at that age. I see definitely I've got a few more years, but I'm starting to move into other aspects of my career as well. So I think those will probably kind of take precedence after that period.
You know, one of the cool things that you got coming up that nobody listening probably knows yet is that the next Avatar movies that are coming out, like 2, 3, and 4. I was with you in Los Angeles, and all the underwater Navi scenes, for those of you guys that don't know, and hopefully James Cameron doesn't sue me for this, but the base of the next Avatars are going to primarily take place underwater, and they use your actual like stroke to really map out how should these crazy Avatar Navi, I think they're Navi, right? Like how should they move underwater? So when that's going to be a kick for you when you watch the next Avatar, being like, that's really me swimming with my official stroke. Do you have a name for that stroke you do, or is that just like the stroke Will does?
No, I don't have a name for it. And yeah, I kind of worked with James to adapt it a little bit for their Navi for swimming underwater. So it's got a little bit of a twist on the stroke, but the guts of it is pretty much as I swim underwater. And I was actually talking to the one of the DOPs for the film recently, and he was saying that he saw some of the what do they call them, the rushes, or like the
like the dailies, the rushes, sure, rough cuts
with some of the animations of these Navi swimming, and it's like when he saw it, it's like, oh, that's William. It looks exactly like the way it swims. I guess they've stuck with that technique for better or worse. It'll be interesting to see if it actually comes out looking.
Oh, that's rad, man. That's really cool. That's cool. Have you heard anything about the release date for that? I think they're still pushing it back to like late 2023 or something, or early 2023.
I think if we see it before we'll kick the bucket, we'll be lucky.
I know. But just think of like how high of there's a few movies in life, like the Matrix movies and like the Jurassic, well, maybe not even Jurassic, but Jurassic Park in some capacity. But like the Avatars, they were really they set the bar so high in terms of like groundbreaking new special effects. Even you look back at, I mean, Avatar stands the test of time today. You look at it, right? And that's what, 10, 15 years ago, to see how good it's going to be in another few years. It's like, I wonder if there's some pressure on them. Like, we got to redo all these graphics now because we took 6 years to get this done. And it looks like Mario Brothers back in 84 or something, you know? But
yeah, I don't know. I think I'm really looking forward to seeing it. From what I've heard, it's almost the next one, Avatar 2, is like 70% underwater. So that's going to be super exciting to see as a freediver, and to see what kind of creatures and environments and everything they come up with for this underwater world is going to be really exciting.
Nice, man. Well, where can people find you the most on Instagram or Facebook? Where do you usually hang out, on what social media platform?
Yeah, on Instagram, I'm at Will Trubridge, and Facebook, I think it's just William Trubridge. Those are the two main ones that I'm hanging out.
And then your school's Vertical Blue. Is that verticalblue.com?
It's verticalblue.net, and my personal website is just williamtrubridge.com.
So do you do like any virtual training if someone wants to learn freediving and they, I mean, is it possible to learn freediving if you live in the middle of Oklahoma and you don't really have, can you work on certain aspects of breath holds and technical things? Or is it like, forget it, kid?
No, you can do breath holds. You can train in the pool as well and do static breath holds there, as well as dynamic, where you're swimming laps underwater. And then once you've trained that for a bit, take a trip to Long Island, Bahamas, or somewhere else, maybe Mexico, and try some depth as well.
Nice.
So our school, verticalblue.net, runs courses down in Long Island, and don't teach them all myself, but I do teach the advanced courses, and I'm also running a trip to the cenotes, which is the sinkholes in Mexico, which I'm excited about. That's next April, I think.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. You guys, is it going to end up being a freediving trip, or is it just a mix of a bunch of people that want to go do like some crazy trip somewhere?
It's mostly freediving, so we'll be kind of going to different sinkholes and the coral reef a little bit. So it's for anyone who has who can swim basically, who wants to try freediving, just wants to hang out for a week. And
not exclusive to world champion freedivers. It's you and 3 people taking a trip. So cool, man. Well, I appreciate you you taking some time out and give the love to the wife and the little ones for me, man. We'll catch up soon.
Thank you. Likewise to yours as well.
All right, man. Take it easy, brother.